Live from Fairfax, it's the Inside Scoop, Virginia. All the news Virginians want to know. Here's your host.
Welcome to Inside Scoop, Virginia. My name is Bettina Lawton, and I'm your host. We are going to be doing a show tonight with the Virginia New Majority. It is a group of progressives here in Virginia. They do lots of work on lots of issues, and towards the end of the show, we're going to be bringing in the Associate Director of Virginia New Majority to give us an update from Richmond about what's been happening down in the General Assembly. This is the last week for the General Assembly session, so hopefully we're seeing some movement on things that have been pending, passed in one house, passed in the other house. We'll see what's been happening since we saw you 2 weeks ago. But I want to introduce the Virginia New Majority to you. We have with us Jon Liss. He is the Executive Director. So I'm going to read your mission statement because it's a pretty good mission statement. It's got lots of good stuff in it. It says, Virginia New Majority is the catalytic force for the progressive transformation of Virginia through mass organizing, leadership, development, and strategic communications. We are creating a powerful movement that transforms Virginia by organizing communities of color, women, working people, LGBTs, youth, and progressive people. Through continuous, purposeful, and strategic activity, we will create a Virginia that is democratic, just, and sustainable. That's a pretty awesome mission statement.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Well, let me tell people who you are, Jon, so that they know. You have organized for racial and social justice for the last 30 some odd years. Originally, back in 79-81, you were at UVA and organized the African American Studies Department. You graduated with a BA in history in 1981 and continued your organizing for U.S. divestment of South African apartheid stocks and regimes, I'm assuming. You were elected a leader of the Taxi Drivers Association at one point, and you also co-founded the Tenant and Workers United in 1986, which was a low-income racial and gender justice organization based in the Arlandra neighborhood. You were the executive director until 2011. Now there's some overlap because you formed the Virginia New Majority in 2007, and you're there as a board member and you're the executive director.
That's right.
All right, excellent. Great. So everything seems to be in your description. You talk about progressive transformation and mass organizing. This seems to be focused sort of at minority communities, immigrants. Is that the whole focus of the Virginia New Majority?
That's the sort of core constituency, but really it's a new majority, as the name implies, is how do you get to 50% plus one and win elections and start transforming our state. So you start off with an African American population, which is concentrated in Tidewater going through Richmond. You have a multinational, multiracial Northern Virginia, as we all know, large immigrant community, large African American community, but you also add in large numbers of white people if you actually want to get to 51%. So it's not exclusively immigrant, it's not exclusively African American. There's a lot of white working people, white progressive, white lesbian and gays who are part of the new majority.
So do you basically not look at places like Southwest? That doesn't seem to have these types of folks in it in any kind of concentration. It's
our
Tidewater,
focus,
Richmond.
It's always a question of priorities and what you can do. So the areas that we focus on are approximately 70% of the population of the state, which is again what's called often the urban crescent from Tidewater through Richmond through Northern Virginia. So that's where we focus our efforts. We have allies and others who work in other parts of the state. Now, unfortunately, because of essentially gerrymandering, even though the areas we described have 70% of the population, they have maybe 45% of the actual delegates and House of Delegates. So we've got problems trying to move our politics through the state assembly at this point.
Well, there's only, 32 members, Democratic members of the House.
Right.
So it's a long road to climb back up to get control of that.
This is patient work.
Okay,
yes.
Patient work. That's an interesting way of putting it.
Yeah.
Long-term perspectives here.
That's
now,
right.
I read somewhere that you had established, or the Virginia New Majority had established something called democracy schools. What are those?
So our idea is that we need to, part of transforming Virginia is developing a whole core of leaders, folks who have a new analysis about how Virginia could be run and have understanding about how to do the organizing necessary to make that happen. So for a couple summers in a row, we've had 2 or 3 weeks of intensive training on organizing, on door knocking, on public speaking, on working with the media. The idea is to develop a whole new core of people who can be actively engaged in transforming Virginia.
Where do you find these people?
So about half have come from within the state and half have come, our work is actually cutting edge in terms of some of the electoral work going around the country. So we have people coming from as far away as California or New York. But about half our people come from Northern Virginia, Tidewater, Richmond.
Okay. And do you advertise if somebody wants to go to a democracy school this coming summer? How do they find out about it?
It'll be up on our website shortly. Actually, I think in April we'll be having a 3-day training that will be open to people. So that we'll get that up on our website very shortly.
And are these done for free? I mean,
there's cost involved. It's not made. It's basically paying for lodging and food, but the actual training is generally free or close to it.
Okay, well, good.
And no one is denied because of lack of money. So if that becomes an issue, just put on your application. We'll work it out.
Okay. All right. And now you also got involved in the Herndon Town Council problem, which we've talked about on this show before, back in the 2008, 2009 timeframe, you started getting all this anti-immigrant stuff going on out in Herndon. So what was your involvement in that?
Sure. And it was sort of interesting. I'd step back and give it a little bit of a sort of broader analysis. I started off doing my organizing in the inner suburbs, Alexandria, a neighborhood that was largely Latino. And over time, from the mid-'80s through the early 2000s, increasing number of folks became either documented citizens, bought a house, and moved, because of the way housing prices work in this region, ended up moving to outer suburbs, be that Prince William or Herndon, for example. So in Herndon, you had a wave of people that moved to Herndon, largely people of color, particularly immigrants, not just Latino, but both African American, Muslim, large community there. It actually had the highest concentration of foreign-born in the entire state. And so you had this sort of political cultural conflict that arose, and in 2006, essentially, there was almost a coup there, and they meaning the Minutemen, backed candidates, won the majority on the council, and immediately set about trying to create a sort of political, legal, and cultural hostility to immigrants. And so that was in 2006, and they shut down a successful day labor center. They put signs up, Spanish won't be spoken here. Some of those were taken down off some of the parks. And the police were used as an instrument of harassment of folks looking for work or actually riding on the bike path without a helmet. And so we did work with candidates out there, and in the last election, actually 2 years ago, there was a majority that was elected that was not Minutemen backed. And however, just because you've elected a majority doesn't mean they're going to have the will necessarily to change the laws. So it took 7 months of intensive organizing for eventually a majority to vote to allow people looking for work to solicit for that work on street corners. It took, by work, it meant talking to, really involving 700 people, individuals out of a town of 20,000. Over 700 people were involved in giving testimony, signing petitions, writing letters, going to meetings, going to protests, speaking publicly. And in the end, the majority of the town council voted to rescind that law and allow people to solicit work on the street corners.
Well, how does that work? Maybe I'm just naive about this, but it's if you're involved in getting a new majority on the town council, and the issue, as I recall those elections, were clearly about the immigrants and how they were being treated in that town, why did it then take another 7 months to get the council to actually do something? It's kind of like, I elected you to do something, I expect you to do it.
So of the 7 members that were elected, 3 we as Virginia Majority endorsed, 1 declined to take an endorsement from us, and 3 were still with the opposition. So the 1 who declined to take the endorsement from us, it took about 7 months to convince her and her colleagues to take the step and actually move a law. So it really took the engagement of 700 people from Latino, immigrant, white, African American from that town stepping up. And it was really actually an experiment in democracy, a good experiment. And they finally did the right thing. So in a way, it should have happened immediately, but it was also encouraging to see the level of engagement from the community in terms of overturning that law.
That is amazing, because 700 people is a lot, and particularly for a town the size of Herndon, that's a substantial number of people to be active It's easy for people to have views
That's
or
right.
sit and watch the television, but to actually be
It was
active.
because it was their neighbors who were being either locked up or harassed, or their friends, or when they saw they had a chance to actually be involved, people actually did step up.
So what's the status of Herndon now? They had another election, I think, last year, didn't
Yeah,
they?
so it's status quo. It's a majority, folks. They elected a new mayor who's much more favorable to immigrants. They're moving forward. Really, things have, not just in Herndon, but throughout the country, as evidenced by the proposals around national immigration reform, things have changed in a lot. So I feel like there's less harassment from the police. They haven't reopened the day labor center or anything like that, but I think it really is a political, cultural transformation that's happening in Herndon. And it's part of what's happening around the country.
And how's it down in Prince William? Do you do work down there? Because they're notorious.
Yeah. It was around the same time and the same sort of politics that came up. Actually, a lot of the bad laws, like in Arizona or Alabama, were really test run here in Virginia, I think because of our proximity to Washington. So we did a lot of work down there. There's some tweaking of the law over time. Last year, the 287G agreement, which leads to federal cooperation with immigration and local authorities, that ended. So I think things have definitely quieted down there. You still have to acknowledge that roughly 20,000 people were driven out of that town. You have to acknowledge that an entire vibrant small business community was wiped out. And there's still a county executive, Corey Stewart, still there, still trying to run statewide now as an anti-immigrant champion. I think his time has come and gone, but he's still down there.
Yeah, I know. He's pretty bad. He's running for what? The lieutenant governor? They have so many on the
There's a lot out
Republican
there.
side. There's like
Yeah.
7 of them or something.
Like I said, I think he's running on an issue that might have helped him 5 years ago. At this point, he's he's flogging the dead horse.
Good, let's hope so. Now you also do a lot of this local work. You also work at the state level on immigration stuff as well, is that right?
That's right. Immigration, Medicaid expansion, and really a lot of voting rights issues.
Okay, excellent. And then we've heard about the Herndon and the work that you did on those elections, but you have a broader involvement in elections, don't you all?
Yes, so like this, in 2012, for example, we knocked down 150,000 doors around the state. In Loudoun, in Prince William, in parts of Fairfax near Centerville, and in Tidewater. We knocked down 150,000 doors. We registered 15,000 people to vote. And we coordinated 180 volunteers who on election day made sure that people were able to get in and out and vote in an easy manner.
Wow, that is excellent.
Thanks.
Well, I can hear the music, which means we're going to go for a break. We're going to stay with us, please. We will be back in a minute.
Around the world, 1 out of every 3 women will be beaten or otherwise abused in their lifetime, often by a family member or loved one. A future free from violence. It's all she's ever wished for.
Did you know you have the power to stop children from joining gangs? You can help a father find a job and home for his family. You can assist a woman who can't afford the medicine she needs to live and the home she can't live without. You can choose to make a difference in our community. Support Volunteers of America, and you can help improve the lives of nearly 2 million Americans each year with programs and services that help individuals and families overcome their challenges to become as independent as possible. Support the programs that are working in our community. Contact Volunteers of America today. Call 1-800-899-0089.
For some folks, saving for the future is easy, but for you, it might take a little more effort. Saving for your future is your responsibility, and there's a lot to save for.
I never thought of that.
Like your child's education, perhaps uncovered medical expenses, or just to be sure you can live the way you want when you retire. The time is now to save for tomorrow. Save now or work forever. The choice is yours. Choose to save.
again, the Inside Scoop, Virginia.
Welcome back. I'm Bettina Lawton, the host of Inside Scoop, Virginia. We are talking tonight with Jon Liss, who is the Executive Director of the Virginia New Majority. So Jon, we were talking when we left about your involvement with campaigns and Get Out the Vote. This is a big year. You were involved in 08, you were involved in 09, and it was a disaster. So we had a great year last year with getting people out. Are you all planning and for this year, for being involved this year?
We're gearing up for this year. In many ways, we look at the whole sort of Obama wins in 2008 in Virginia and in the country, and then what happened right afterwards in Virginia set the table for really a couple disastrous years where there was pushback on healthcare reform, where there was pushback on the entire progressive agenda that we all thought we had supported and elected. So we view this year as really an important year in terms of politics in the entire country, not just Virginia. So we have governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, and the entire House of Delegates. And the thing that we actually, I think, work hardest on is getting people to understand, getting people in Virginia, getting new voters in Virginia to understand that the local elections, the state level elections, have as much to do with their everyday life as anybody they elect to Washington. So you can elect and get national health care reform, but it's really Governor McDonald and the House of Delegates and the state Senate that are going to determine how it really looks like in the state of Virginia.
Do you think the fact that Ken Cuccinelli is going to be apparently the Republican candidate, given his high profile and the positions that he's taken against the scientists at UVA, against the Board of Health involved with the abortion clinic regulations, with his EPA stance, his suit against Obamacare, he has had a very aggressive profile, very conservative, very anti-Obama everything. Do you think the fact that he's a candidate will help get people who might normally not vote this year out to vote, that it sort of demonstrates what you just said, that who is the governor makes a big difference?
I'm hoping that if people care about climate change, they'll vote. I'm hoping if they're women who have their rights abridged because of Ken Cuccinelli, they'll vote. We're hoping that communities of color will vote. Yeah, I think it's going to be a big motivator because he's pretty unabashed in his politics and pretty clear about who he goes after. He's tried to moderate it over the last 6 weeks, but there's really a a decade-long record of the guy, public record, that's pretty atrocious. So we think that's going to be a big motivator for people to get out and vote, and that's our job, to sort of make people understand the importance of getting out and voting.
So his record, because it's more current, you think will be more persuasive. When McDonald ran and he moderated himself, there was that big thing about his thesis. But he was able to say, oh, that was 20 years ago.
It was 20 years ago, a college thing, what have you, youthful indiscretion maybe. So, I think Cuccinelli is actually generally not running away from his record, though he's tried to moderate some of his stands over the last 6 weeks during the General Assembly session, but generally he's out there. I have him on tape just recently at a Christian event going after the Catholic bishops for creating a culture of dependency and entitlement. So he's pretty broad in who he goes after and pretty proud of it. So that's what motivates his base. He's going to have an energized group of people behind him, but we think it's going to be a minority base, a base of less than 50% of the voters in Virginia.
What do you think Lieutenant Governor Bowling is going to do? Do you think he'd run an independent race? He seems pretty annoyed at Ken Cuccinelli and for not honoring the agreement that he had with the governor as opposed to Cuccinelli.
Let's put it this way. I think he's been positioning himself. He's taken a number of votes somewhat distant from the majority in the state Senate and taken some positions that are actually somewhat better, or at least somewhat distant from the sort of Tea Party influenced folks. So I think he's positioning himself. In elections, it often comes down to money. My guess is he's trying to see what sort of financial backing he can get. I, for one, would offer him $5 to get him in the race. I think that would make it a very interesting race, but I think it would actually help probably Terry McAuliffe to help him to become the governor.
Right, and that was sort of my assessment of it. It would really give people who don't want to vote for Ken Cuccinelli an alternative, but the folks who are going to support Terry are going to support Terry no matter what.
Yes, that's right.
In that lineup, anyway.
That's right, because actually, if you look at the polling right now, in a two-way race, it's nip and tuck. It's within a point either way. So it's really going to be a important and very close race. Our hope is over time, again, as we can motivate people to understand what's at stake here, that we can get higher voter turnout.
Well, let's talk about another issue that you all are dealing with, which when I heard about it, I was kind of like, well, how does that all relate to the other things that you're doing? And that's an issue involving the Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority. Let me set it up because some people confuse it with the subway system because there is a connection. But MWAA is a 17-member board of directors, and it runs Dulles and National Airport. And where people get confused with Metro is it's responsible for actually designing and building the Silver Line out to Dulles Airport, and then it'll turn it over to the Metro Authority itself. Now, there was a Department of Transportation Inspector General report that came out last November that was entitled, I did love the title, MWA's weak policies and procedures have led to questionable procurement practices, mismanagement, and a lack of overall accountability. So what's your involvement with this? What's going on that's gotten your interest?
A couple things, and I'll just say part of what we've seen happen over time is Dulles Airport used to be out in sort of the country. It was a cow field. The biggest bidding was how much you would pay for those big mobile lounges that would drive you around. And now it's actually in the economic center, heart of Virginia. So in terms of Loudoun, Fairfax, a lot of money, a lot of wealth out there, and there's been a lot of projects subsequently being built as it's a major airport now. And hence, we haven't transformed and we don't have an accountable board. So I think a couple things about why Virginia New Majority cares about Dulles and cares about MWAA. One is it really is about democracy. So how do we get transparent and democratic decision makers around public resources? That's one. Two, it really is about mass transit, which is related to climate change, and how do we have efficient use of public dollars to invested in ways to move people around this region, both addressing traffic issues, but we think reducing the carbon footprint of this region. And the third thing is, if you do these contract right, and if you actually use union labor, you can get more money into working people's hands. And over these last couple decades, we've seen a huge transfer of wealth to the extreme wealthy, the so-called 1%, and we've seen it come out of the hand of the working people, middle-class people, folks who work, get up and punch the clock every day. And we know that if you do a negotiated settlement, if you have a project labor agreement, you actually probably get union workers out there who are getting both decent wages and benefits. And we think that's really critical. It used to be when you worked full-time in this country, you had health benefits. That's not the case anymore, but a union job actually has health benefits.
Well, and the project labor agreement was used in phase one, and I know the CEO of MWAA has actually been quoted recently, in fact, sometime last week, saying that he says the project labor agreement is one of the reasons why phase one of the Silver Line is coming in on time and on budget. So, but unfortunately, so we can encourage people to actually go out and vote this year, the General Assembly forbids the project labor agreement from being included in phase two. So is that part of the problem of what's going to be going on now?
Very much the part of the problem. I mean, and the Wilson Bridge is another local project that was built with a project labor agreement, came in on time, on budget. And so there can be difference in political differences, but when you sort of have, and I'm saying the conservative element within the General Assembly has sort of an ideological blinder, and you sort of do things against common sense or against things that work, you get problems. And so the what do you call it? The Aero train out there came in at basically twice the bid. I mean, meaning they accepted one price to do the work, and by the time it got done, built 2 years late, it cost almost $180 million extra.
And they did that, because I recall reading about that, it was something like 80 some odd changes to the contract, change orders, and of course I tend to look at these things and say, really? Couldn't you have figured that out when you did your original bid, that here's what needed to be done? But it did come in way over budget.
Yeah, if you look at the Inspector General's report, you realize that maybe we should all become contractors working for MWAA, because it seems like you basically bid low and then come in with change orders every 10 minutes and you end up with double the money that you bid. So a $180 million contract becomes a $360 or $380 million payout.
Now, the way they're doing the phase two, they're doing a different kind of bidding than the first time. As I recall, the first time they actually negotiated a price, and this time they're doing what? They're going with a low bidder?
The low bid, but the low bid and so the proposal that we're trying to promulgate, push forward, is that if fine, you want to accept the low bid, anytime you come in with a contract change that's going to be add up to $100,000 or more in the contract, it needs to come back before the board for a public vote. We want both the contractor and the board to be held accountable for their work performance. We don't think that's an unusual thing to ask. That level of money, and it has a public impact, because who pays for it? Most of the dollars from that comes from the toll. The riders up and down the Dulles Access Road are paying for what's being built out there. So we think as a public accountability measure, it's important to have this provision in any contract. Fine, take the lowest bid. Anytime they come in with a change order that's going to cost the public some more money, then vote on it publicly. Go on the record, both you and the company.
Well, and they should be able to figure it out, because you have phase one has already been built, and it's been built right now. It's not like, well, 10 years ago we did it and we couldn't anticipate that it would cost this or that, or we'd have this kind of a problem. So you would think even on a low bid cost that they would be more accurate in it.
Unless it's used as a tactic to get the contract and then jack it up over time. I mean, which is unfortunately the most recent practice. There's a sort of not a recent history anyway, of a board that hasn't been the most high functioning, we'll say, in the region.
Well, considering you end up with the Department of Transportation doing an audit and coming back and saying they have terrible ethics, they have no policies, apparently they delegated contracting authority outside of their contracting office and then couldn't remember who had the authority. So it was really kind of egregious when I was reading through that.
Yeah, I think they said that they had like 24 people that had some authority for contracts, at least 8 had egregious violations, ethical and otherwise. And then you have with itself dealing with the board and board members and former board members. So there's really a need for sort of public accountability and transparency to sort of get that house back in order. It's too big a hub for the entire region to leave it in the hands of 17 people without the public eye on it.
Well, and having them have to do it at a public meeting, because this is not like a government agency where the Freedom of Information Act would apply. So having it at that public meeting, I think, is key to the proposal that you're making.
I agree, very much so.
So we'll have to see. Hopefully people will get out, those people who are incensed out in Reston on the toll road raises, because you're right. If it goes over budget, those tolls are going to be even worse than they are right now.
It's going to be more than a roll of quarters you need to bring with you every day.
That's absolutely right. Well, we are going to be back after these public service announcements, and we're going to be bringing in the Associate Director from Virginia New Majority to talk to us about what's going on in Richmond. Stay tuned.
Too many women get hit by their boyfriends and husbands. Too many women are pressured into having unprotected sex. Half of the people in the world living with AIDS are women. It doesn't have to be this way. Together, we can change this reality. Let's strive for a world free of violence.
At Volunteers of America, we don't just give kids a way to stay off the streets. We give them the tools they need to reach their full potential. We don't just help the elderly receive needed care. We help them live life to the fullest. We don't just provide food for homeless individuals and families. We provide job training and placement so they can buy groceries. Volunteers of America is a national organization that for over 100 years has provided programs and services that allow people to overcome their challenges to become vital members of their community. At Volunteers of America, we don't just help people, we help people help themselves. Find out how you can support the programs that are working in your community. Contact Volunteers of America today. Call 1-800-899-0089.
Drivers face all kinds of distractions.
Guys, stop playing. No. Of 127 consecutive.
Before your wireless phone becomes one of them, stop. Drive safely. Keep your phone in easy reach and dial sensibly. In bad weather or traffic, call later and use a hands-free device. Remember, with wireless, safety is your call.
Here again, the Inside Scoop, Virginia.
Welcome back. I'm Bettina Lawton, the host for Inside Scoop Virginia. We have with us in the studio today Jon Liss, and we are bringing in by Skype Tram Nguyen, who is the Associate Director of Virginia New Majority. She's going to be joining us from Richmond, where she is working hard down at the General Assembly. So while they bring her in via Skype, let me tell you about her. Tram joined the Virginia New Majority in 2008, but she started out with working after the September 11th attacks, trying to get federal funding for the health treatment to address the problems that the first responders and the recovery people had as a result of working at Ground Zero. She's also been involved with rescue efforts in Hurricane Katrina, working with over 30,000 Vietnamese immigrants whose lives were devastated by that event. And she's also worked in New Orleans, Biloxi, and Alabama to advocate for sustainable redevelopment of immigrant communities and businesses. And she is an alumna of Barnard College, Columbia University, and was the 2010 Lead the Way volunteer at the New York University Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. So I think we have Tram. There she is. Hey, Tram, can you hear us?
I can.
Excellent. Well, you're down in Richmond. We've got a couple of big issues that hopefully you can tell us about, and then anything else that's new and breaking, we of course want to know anyway. Medicaid expansion. I've seen a lot about that in the last couple of days. I'm getting tons of emails about this. So could you set the stage for us and tell us why Medicaid expansion is such a big deal in Virginia?
Sure. What's at stake is 400,000 Virginians, uninsured Virginians, could potentially get access to health care if the Commonwealth decided to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. It also creates 30,000 new jobs throughout the Commonwealth, and it could save the Commonwealth a lot of money over the next several years. And frankly, Virginia has already paid taxes into the federal tax dollars. So it's a no-brainer for us to expand Medicaid, but unfortunately it's a contentious issue down in Richmond.
Well, I was surprised to read that in Fairfax, Loudoun, and Arlington, so those are sort of the areas up here, that a family of 3 people who have income, collective income into the family of just over $5,900, that they're not eligible for Medicaid. I had thought that Medicaid was for the poor people. And you can't live in Fairfax County, or Arlington for that matter, on less than $6,000 for a family of 3. So how is that true with the rest of Virginia? Is that a set amount? How does that work?
Right. I mean, Virginia ranks among the bottom in terms of providing health care for low-income folks. For a family of 4 in the Commonwealth, I think the income eligibility level was around 7,000. So we're at the very, very bottom in terms of Medicaid eligibility.
Which is kind of pathetic, and since we're in the top 10 for the wealthiest state in the union.
Absolutely.
It sort of says what we think of helping actually everyone, sort of as opposed to our name, which is a commonwealth. That doesn't seem to be what we're doing at all. Well, let me ask, because I read something that said of the uninsured population, there's a huge disparity between the percentage in the population and the percentage of uninsured people. So for example, the Latinos are about 8% of the population in Virginia, but they're a third of the people who are uninsured. And it's similar kind of statistics for Asian Americans, African Americans. Why is there such a huge disparity in these various ethnic groups?
Frank, I'm sorry, there was a lot of background noise. I couldn't really hear your entire question.
Well, it's why is there such a disparity by ethnic group in the number of uninsureds in Virginia? So you've got a huge number of, percentage-wise, of Latinos who are uninsured versus their relatively small percentage in the population.
Well, I think, if you look at demographics, most of the minority population are working class folks who their income levels are different and socioeconomic wise. And I think a lot of it is also navigating the system and figuring out whether they're eligible or not.
Okay. Now what happens? You said there are 400,000 people could get insurance if we do this. Can Virginia actually afford to do this?
Virginia will actually save money if it chooses to expand Medicaid. For the first 3 years of the Medicaid expansion, the federal government actually picks up the tab 100%. And so what the General Assembly is considering, and there are different versions in the Senate and the House, but what Virginia is considering is a series of reform in concert with the Medicaid expansion that will actually, over the course of several years, save the Commonwealth several $100 million that should actually be saved in a fund that is specifically for healthcare, so that we don't, use that money for other needs. But this actually saves the Commonwealth a lot of money. Folks who are using emergency rooms as their primary care facility, we could really be looking at preventive care and making sure that people have healthy lifestyles.
So in theory, the federal government's going to pay for this for the first several years, and then Virginia has to pay after that? Is that where we really get hit?
Well, Virginia will have to, I think that for the first 3 years, the federal government picks up the full tab, and then every year thereafter they start graduating the amount that the state has to pay in. But keep in mind that the state can opt out of this at any time. So if there's a point where it's costing the Commonwealth more money than is fiscally possible through the general fund or through whatever healthcare fund, then the Commonwealth can opt out of the Medicaid program.
And where does it stand? I'd heard some version of it passed in the Senate. It hasn't passed in the House. Where does the whole thing stand?
Well, right now it's working its way through the budget. The Senate budget, they passed I think a better version where it allows for the expansion of Medicaid to happen as long as the federal government approves certain reform measures that the state is looking to implement, but that the reform can happen parallel to the expansion. The House version is a little bit more stricter. It requires 3 phases of Medicaid, of healthcare reform and Medicaid reform before the state will actually opt into the expansion, and the 2014 General Assembly will have to actually approve the expansion. And so it's a little bit more restrictive. The timeline isn't as immediate as the Senate version. So right now, both the House and the Senate are in what they call a budget conference committee, and they'll work out the differences between the 2 budgets and see what they come out with.
Well, if it's a budget, so the Medicaid expansion is part of a budget negotiation. That means that in the Senate, the lieutenant governor can't vote if there's a tie. So they really have to come to some realistic agreement to pull both sides on this then.
Yes, the Lieutenant Governor Bowling cannot cast a tiebreaker, and so it's really up to the conference committee to come out with something that both chambers can vote on. On the Senate, there's bipartisan support for Medicaid expansion, so we're very hopeful that that will remain in the budget.
The House of Delegates, did they vote whatever their version was? I guess they passed something because they're in conference, but how do they are overwhelmingly Republican over there. How much do you think they're going to go along with what the Senate wants?
Honestly, I don't know. I am not entirely hopeful, but I think, that's what the conference committee, they've been in closed door sessions and they've been meeting up until 10 o'clock every night to try to work something out. We'll get a sense, we'll know actually what their recommendations are on Thursday because they'll have to submit their conference report and then it'll go back to the respective floors for a bit.
So this is going to take us right to the end because this is their last week in session, right?
Yeah, the session ends on Saturday. There's talk of a possible special session, but I think most legislators are ready to get out of here on Saturday. So we're hopeful that something will be resolved.
Yeah, I always thought the special session would be like transportation, not Medicaid expansion. So that would be, I guess, annoy people. Now, McDonnell had come out opposed to Medicaid expansion. Is he still opposed? So even if they agree between the House and the Senate, we could still be looking at McDonnell vetoing it?
It's a possibility. The governor hasn't stated publicly any change in his position. Again, I'm sure he's following these conference negotiations pretty closely. There is a possibility that if it does get included into the final General Assembly budget, that the governor could, veto or change the budget, and we'll find out in April during veto session.
Wow. Now, I want to also ask, because you have done, and Jon in our first set of segments talked about the fact that the Virginia new majority has been involved in these voter ID bills and the voter suppression efforts. So I want to talk to you about those, because there were a lot of different bills that seem to have been introduced, and I'm not sure where all of them stand. So let me first ask the one that I think I know the answer to. There were a number of bills introduced by various Senate Democrats, I think, to expand the early voting, the early absentee. Right now you have to tell people why. It's a whole big process. Most people, as I understand it, could actually qualify, because there's like 19 different versions of why you can't vote on Election Day. But there was an effort to make it be a no excuse. You want to vote early, you fill out the form, you vote early. A number of states have this. My understanding is that all of those were defeated, so that those aren't on the table. There's no conferences going on. Those are dead, right?
Yeah, those actually never made it out of committee, so those died swiftly.
Wow, that's pretty pathetic to not even get out of committee. It's because it seems to me, anyway, to be such a basic good idea, and why people are against it, particularly when we had all those lines and all those people having to stand around trying to vote on Election Day last year. This would seem like a no-brainer to me.
No, that's right.
Yeah, sorry.
No, go, Tram.
Now, there have been a number of proposals in the General Assembly to try to address the long lines, and not a single bill is actually making it out that fixes our Election Day problem. It's been very disheartening this entire session to see all of these good bills get defeated.
Wow, I didn't realize there were a bunch of others. It's kind of like, that's really depressing.
You can look at North Carolina, where voters can, same day, you can register to vote and vote on the same day. Or you can look in Oregon, where you can mail in your vote. So you can eliminate obstacles if you want to, or you can maintain barriers if you want to. Obviously, our state has been trying to prevent people from participating in democracy.
Well, stay with us, because we're going to be back and talk some more about this.
She's had more than a dozen fractures. And in the next few years, she faces 2 major surgeries to strengthen her fragile bones. She's only 10 years old. Most people don't worry about fragile bones until late in life. For those with osteogenesis imperfecta, brittle bones are a concern throughout their lifetime. Find out how you can strengthen this child's future.
Diabetes is a killer. After I was diagnosed, I didn't feel sick, so I didn't listen to my doctor. Then it struck. I had a heart attack, then a stroke, and I was only 49.
Most people with diabetes also have high blood pressure and cholesterol, which can cause severe heart damage. In fact, 2 out of 3 people with diabetes die from heart disease or stroke.
Don't let diabetes destroy your life.
Call for your free diabetes survival guide. Choose to live.
Here again, the Inside Scoop, Virginia.
Welcome back. I'm Bettina Lawton, the host of Inside Scoop, Virginia. I have with me in the studio Jon Liss, who is the Executive Director of the Virginia New Majority. And coming to us from Richmond via Skype is Tram Nguyen, who is the Associate Director of Virginia New Majority. And when we left, we were talking about the voter suppression bills and the status in the General Assembly. And let's go to something else, because there was another bill that I had heard about. When you go to vote absentee in person, you have to give all kinds of information. So if you're claiming a disability, you're supposed to say what your disability is. If you are taking care of somebody with a disability, you have to say who they are, what their disability is. Service people are supposed to give like their military ID number. There's all kinds of things that some privacy people are pretty upset about. Where is that in the legislature? Is that still active, or has that been shot down too, sort of amending what you have to do for these early absentee?
Well, fortunately, that one is actually alive, and I think it'll get out of the General Assembly and make it to the governor's desk. So we ran into a couple of hiccups with some technical adjustments that the State Board of Elections had with the language in the bill, but we worked through it, and Senator Adam Ebbin sponsored that bill, and it looks like it's going to pass.
Wow, that's amazing. Something good is getting passed. How did that happen? There was also, I read a while ago, people were trying to expand, so not unlimited early voting, but try to add what you could do to vote early. So there was something that said if you're old, you could vote early, or if you were young with kids, you could vote early, and there were a whole bunch of other kind of early voting things. Where do those things stand? Did any of those make it through?
It made it out of the Senate, but it got killed in the House. It got defeated. The House Privileges and Elections Committee defeated the early voting, absentee voting for 65 and older, because it would cost the state $10,000 in its first year and $6,000 every year thereafter, and so that there wasn't money. Which was unfortunate, because we ran into so many issues this past election with long lines. Every voter who is 65 and older is eligible for curbside voting, which takes a lot of resources out of the polls on election day, because it takes 2 staffers to go to the curb with the machine to allow that person to vote. So, allowing 65-year-olds and older to vote absentee, I think, is a no-brainer, because it eases the burden on our poll workers, but that did not make it out of the House.
Wow. That's too bad. I had some hope for that, because it made it through something, and I thought, well, maybe they'll do that, because we had in Fairfax, as you may know, one of the precincts that was voting really late, hours later, was at a senior community where you had all of these old folks. This is November. They're standing out in the cold. Right. It was just ridiculous. So it's discouraging to realize that they're not going to be able to do it, and that the legislation that might mitigate all of these long lines, that legislation didn't make it through either. This is not good. Let's go to longer hours at the poll. I read there was something about expanding the hours till later in the evening to try and have people be able to spread out how long they had to vote. Did that go through? Did that make it?
That did not make it either, and even a more limited version of that would allow expansion of polling hours in cases of emergency. So if you remember, I think in the 2011 special election in August, primary election in August, there was an earthquake that we faced, and then this recent election, there was the big storm that moved through and went up to the northeast, and so even a provision for emergency extension of polling hours got defeated.
Wow. All right, I'm going to try again.
You're persistent.
I'm persistent. I'm trying here. Voter ID. Now, there were 2 kinds of voter ID bills, as I recall. There was a bunch that the Republicans introduced that said, we're not going to allow you to use a lot of the stuff like utility bills and things like that you could use last year. So there was an effort to restrict what you could use. Did those go through?
Well, so that's where we are right now. There's two versions of an ID legislation that are still pending. There's the one that removes all of those extra forms of ID, the utility bill, bank statement, paychecks, that sort of thing, but keeps everything else, including a concealed handgun permit, as a valid form of ID. So as long as that bill says, as long as you have a picture on an ID or your current name and address, then it's a valid form of ID. The other ID we have is the more restrictive photo ID proposal that would actually require a photo identification in order to vote on election day. And that's definitely more restrictive. There's some changes to that proposal that would require registrars to actually issue these photo IDs instead of the DMV, which, introduces a whole new host of problems.
Well, that would be a little tough. Registrars' offices are not set up to take people's pictures and produce that. I mean, if you don't have enough money to let 65 and older folks vote early, I don't know how you get the money to put that burden onto the registrar's office. That doesn't make a lot of sense.
Absolutely. And, not all registrar's offices are accessible either. And so if you think about Fairfax County, the registrar office being at the government center, and then if you look at somebody down in Huntington, which is near a metro station, they might not even have access to transportation all the way out there because they take metro and commute into work every day. If they don't have a photo ID, they're required to go to the registrar's office to obtain it for free. It's an unnecessary burden, and it actually puts a great hardship on these voters.
Now, how do they, because one of the things, I keep hearing them say, oh, we're going to do these IDs for free. But you have to get whatever proof you need in order for them to give you one. And I remember hearing about all this, it was some older lady in the central part of Virginia who had never had a birth certificate. She was sufficiently older. She was in the minority community. She was born at home. She didn't have a birth certificate. And they used to take I think it was maybe a baptismal kind of certificate. And then they said, no, we can't do that anymore. And it became a whole big issue of how do you get the ID if you don't already have these other forms of identification, and the time commitment to get them, the cost involved in trying to get them. I'm assuming, because this is Virginia, that all of those costs sort of preparatory to getting this free voter ID are going to have to be borne by the individual voters.
Well, the way that the proposal is written, yes, it would have to be borne by the individual. Thankfully, court cases have ruled that in order for any state to have a photo ID requirement to vote, they actually have to provide those supporting documents or help individuals obtain them. And so when you look at the fiscal impact of the photo ID legislation before us, it doesn't take into account all of those things. So I think the cost to the Commonwealth is actually a lot greater than what these legislators are voting on. The current fiscal impact says $166,000 in the first year and $200,000 over the next 5 years. The Commonwealth Institute for Fiscal Analysis, based on what Georgia and other states with photo ID law have spent, anywhere between $7 and $22 million because of all of these expenses that are just hidden costs.
Wow, that's enormous. Now, I'm not sure that I'm clear on this. So you said there are two different kind of photo ID proposals out there. So if I have anything with my picture and my address and my name on it, that would count under one proposal, and then the other one is what, a DMV issued, official government issue? What are the options here?
So under one proposal, it simply removes the paycheck, bank statements, utility bills, and it says that any other form of ID that's currently in the code is eligible. So that would be, for example, a student ID, an employer ID, the concealed handgun permit, or a government issued ID. So anything that contains either a photograph or your current name and address. So for example, some student IDs don't have a picture, but they have your current name and address, that should work. Your voter registration card should still be eligible. The photo ID says that it has to be a photo ID, so it requires your picture. And if you don't have a government issued photo identification, then you can get one at the registrar's office. and they'll take it, and I guess that qualifies as government-issued photo ID.
Wow. But Virginia spent $2 million last year when they amended the voter ID law in the last session. So changing it again so soon, that's like a wasted $2 million if all of a sudden you're saying to people, you can't use all the things we told you about last year. When people keep saying, oh, we can't afford this, we can't afford that, that seems absolutely insane to me that this is their view. They're going to change it again.
Right, and to be clear, it's only been 6 months since the State Board of Elections initiated its education campaign on last year's voter ID bill. So to change it within 6 months, again, I would argue requires even more public education than last year, because you don't want the voter confusion. And, again, that 6 month period is so short.
I mean, I would just add in that, this is the whole argument around the Virginia new majority, is that there really is an emerging new, not just electoral, but political majority that has a view about how mass transit should work in our state, about how access to public and higher education should work in our state, and how taxes should be spent and be collected in our state. And there's folks who are stopping at nothing to prevent that new majority from voting. So you have the photo ID, you shut polls down early, even though we know in all the urban areas, it's hard to get home by 7 o'clock to vote. I mean, you have to really make an effort, and if there's an accident or it rains, you're out of luck. So the point is, if you want to make an inclusive participatory democracy, the new majority is coming right around the corner, and there's some folks who, with their last breath, are trying to prevent us from voting, basically.
Well, that's really, because that is the bottom line of all of these things as we're going through here and saying what passed and what didn't pass, is that people's ability to vote. I mean, voting is fundamental to democracy. I hear a lot of immigrants who become citizens, then after their first election, they're like so excited. They are going to vote. This is something that they can do. And all of this sort of denies that. It sort of makes it harder. We're putting roadblocks in the path of people who really want to vote, whether you're newly immigrant citizen, whether you're an older person, whether you've got young kids and it's hard to get there. It's all right. Blocking it.
Very much so.
Well, this is discouraging, but I thank you, Tram, for bringing us up to date on it all in any event. So I'm so glad to have had you here, and we will have you back again to talk about how things are going as this year progresses. Great. So we want to thank everyone for coming and watching tonight. The VirginiaNewMajority.org is the website where you can find these good people. I look forward to seeing you the next time.